The Bottle of Sand. Chapter 1. A Grain from Nazare. Clara Vincent arrived in Nazare on a quiet morning in late spring. The town was peaceful, with white houses climbing the hills and fishing boats resting on the shore. The ocean moved slowly, as if remembering something. Clara walked along the beach with a small cloth bag in her hand and a glass bottle in her backpack. She was not here for vacation. She had come to collect sand from the place where her brother had died many years ago. It was not a dramatic death, not one that made headlines. He had drowned during a storm, pulled under by waves that looked calm from the surface. Clara had never returned since that day. Now, at 42, she felt ready. She walked slowly, letting her feet sink into the warm sand. The beach was almost empty, just a few locals walking their dogs and a couple of children building castles. Clara found a quiet spot near the rocks, where the sand was dry and golden. She knelt down and scooped a handful into her cloth bag. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the past. She simply sat there, watching the waves, listening to the wind, and remembering her brother's laugh. He had been younger than her, full of energy and dreams. His death had changed her life. It had pushed her into silence, into travel, into collecting memories instead of making them. That evening, Clara sat on the balcony of her small guest house. The sun was setting, painting the sky with orange and pink. She opened her backpack and took out the glass bottle. It was simple, with a cork lid and a label that read, Nazare. She poured a few grains of sand into her palm and held them up to the light. One grain caught her eye. It sparkled slightly, as if holding something inside. Clara leaned closer, and for a moment, everything around her faded. She saw a vision, brief and soft, like a dream. Her brother was alive. He stood beside her in a different city, smiling, holding a camera. She was laughing, wearing a red coat she had never owned. The buildings behind them were unfamiliar, but the feeling was clear. It was joy. It was a life that had never happened. Clara blinked and the vision was gone. The grain of sand lay still in her hand. She felt a chill, not from fear, but from wonder. What had she seen? Was it a memory? A dream? Or something else? She looked at the bottle and thought about her journey. She had collected sand from many places before, but never like this. This was different. This sand held something more. It was not just a symbol of the past. It was a key to something hidden. Clara began to understand that each grain might be a window into another version of her life. A life shaped by a different choice, a different moment, a different path. She sat quietly for a long time, thinking about the choices she had made. The places she had visited, the people she had left behind, the things she had said and not said. She had always believed that life moved in one direction, that the past was fixed. But now, with this grain of sand in her hand, she felt something shift. Maybe the past was not fixed. Maybe every choice created a new thread, a new story, a new reality. And maybe, just maybe, the sand remembered. Clara placed the grain back into the bottle and sealed it carefully. She wrote a note in her journal, Nazare. Vision of another life. Brother alive. Red coat. Unknown city. She did not try to explain it. She simply recorded it, like an archivist collecting fragments of time. She knew this was only the beginning. She would travel again, collect more sand, and look deeper into the grains. She was no longer just remembering. She was discovering. And with each grain, she was learning that life was not one story, but many. Some lived, some lost, and some waiting to be seen. Chapter 2. Sand from Evora. Clara Vincent arrived in Evora on a warm afternoon. The sun touched the old stone buildings with golden light, and the narrow streets echoed with quiet footsteps. The city felt ancient, full of memory and silence. Clara had visited Evora once before, many years ago, when she was offered a job at a small historical archive near the university. She had turned it down, choosing instead to continue traveling. At the time, it felt like the right decision. But now, standing in the same place again, she wondered what might have happened if she had stayed. She walked slowly through the city, passing whitewashed houses and quiet courtyards. She reached the wall near the archive building, the same wall where she had once stood, thinking about her future. The stones were warm from the sun, and the ground beneath them was covered with fine, dry sand. Clara knelt down and scooped a small amount into her cloth bag. She felt calm, but also curious. She had learned in Nazare that the sand could show her something more, something hidden inside each grain. That evening, Clara sat in a quiet room with a view of the rooftops. She poured a few grains of sand into her palm and held them up to the light. One grain shimmered faintly, and her breath slowed. The world around her faded, and she saw a vision. It was herself, sitting at a desk in a quiet office, surrounded by books and papers. She looked older, more polished, dressed in a formal suit. Her hair was tied back, and her face was serious. She was giving a lecture to a small group of students, speaking with confidence and knowledge. The room was filled with respect, but also distance. After the lecture, she walked home alone, through the same streets, without speaking to anyone. Clara blinked and returned to the present. The grain of sand lay still in her hand. The vision had felt real, like a memory from a life she had never lived. She thought about the version of herself she had seen, successful, respected, but alone. That life had meaning, but it lacked warmth. It lacked the freedom she had found in her travels. Clara did not feel regret, but she felt something close to it. She wondered if that version of herself had ever laughed freely, or danced in the rain, or watched the stars without thinking about work. She opened her journal and began to write. She described the vision in simple words, noting the details, the suit, the lecture, the silence. She added a small sketch of the office, the books, and the expression on her own face. Then she drew a line from Nazare to Evora, marking each place with a symbol. She was building a map, not of geography, but of possibility. Each grain of sand was a point on that map, a version of herself shaped by a different choice. Clara realized that her journey was changing. It was no longer just about collecting sand. It was about collecting lives. Lives she could have lived, lives she had walked away from, lives that still whispered to her through the grains. She felt both small and wide, like a single thread in a great tapestry. She did not know where the journey would lead, but she knew she had to keep going. The sand was speaking, and she was ready to listen. She looked out the window at the quiet city. The rooftops glowed in the fading light, and the air was still. Somewhere below, people were living their lives, making choices, creating new paths. Clara held the bottle close and whispered a silent thank you to the version of herself she had seen. She did not envy her. She simply honored her. And then she turned the page in her journal, ready for the next grain, the next vision, the next step in the journey. Chapter 3. Sand from Sintra. Clara Vincent arrived in Sintra on a misty morning. The hills were covered in green, and the air smelled of moss and old stone. The town was quiet, wrapped in fog, with winding roads leading to palaces and gardens. Clara had always found Sintra beautiful, but this time it felt heavier. She had come to collect sand near the castle where, years ago, she had made a choice that stayed with her. It was the place where she had said no to love. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she was afraid of losing herself. She had walked away from someone who had offered her a life of warmth and stillness, and she had chosen movement instead. She climbed the path to the castle slowly, remembering the day she had stood there with him. His name was Thomas. He had been kind, patient, and full of quiet dreams. He had wanted a home, a garden, and a life shared with her. Clara had wanted the world, the unknown, the freedom to change. She had told him goodbye near the castle wall, and he had let her go without anger. That moment had stayed with her like a soft ache that never left. Now, standing in the same place, she knelt down and gathered a handful of sand from the edge of the path. It was pale and fine, mixed with fallen leaves and tiny stones. She placed it in her bottle, labeled it Sintra, and walked back to her guest house in silence. That evening, Clara sat by the window, watching the fog roll through the trees. She poured a few grains of sand into her palm and held them up to the light. One grain shimmered gently, and the world around her faded. She saw a vision, soft and quiet. She was in a small house surrounded by tall trees. The windows were open, and sunlight touched the wooden floor. She was sitting at a table with Thomas, laughing over breakfast. There were books on the shelves, plants in the corners, and music playing in the background. Outside, a garden bloomed with wildflowers. She looked older, but peaceful. Her eyes were full of light, and her hands moved slowly, with care. It was a life of stillness, of shared mornings and quiet evenings. Clara blinked and returned to the present. The grain of sand lay still in her hand. The vision had felt real, not like a dream, but like a memory from a life she had never lived. She felt a mix of pain and tenderness. Pain for what she had walked away from, and tenderness for the love that had once been offered to her. She did not regret her choice, but she understood it more deeply now. She had chosen movement, and it had given her many things: freedom, knowledge, and discovery. But it had also taken something. It had taken the chance to build a life with someone who had loved her. She opened her journal and wrote carefully. She described the house, the garden, the feeling of peace. She drew a small sketch of the table, the light, and the trees. She added a note: Sintra. Vision of love kept. A life of quiet joy. She did not judge herself. She simply recorded what she saw. She was learning that every choice had weight, and every path had its own kind of beauty. The sand was not showing her mistakes. It was showing her possibilities. It was helping her understand that life was not about right or wrong, but about what we carry and what we leave behind. Clara sat by the window until the fog lifted. The stars appeared above the hills, and the night grew still. She held the bottle close and whispered a quiet thank you to the version of herself who had stayed. She did not envy her. She honored her. That life was not hers, but it was real. And in that moment, Clara felt both whole and open. She was not just one person. She was many. And the sand was helping her see them all. Chapter 4. Sand from Porto. Clara Vincent arrived in Porto just as the sky turned silver with soft morning clouds. The city felt alive, full of color and sound. The narrow streets climbed and twisted between old buildings with tiled walls and iron balconies. The scent of roasted coffee and fresh bread drifted from open cafes, and the sound of the river echoed between the hills. Clara had always loved Porto, but this visit felt different. She had come not as a tourist, but as a seeker. She was following the quiet thread of her past, returning to a place where she had once made a quiet but important decision. Years ago, Clara had spent several months in Porto. She had arrived with no plan, only a suitcase and a tired heart. She had found a small room above a bakery and a part-time job in a bookshop near the river. The work was simple, stacking books, helping customers, making tea, but it gave her peace. She had made friends, shared long dinners, and walked the cobbled streets at night. For a moment, she had considered staying. The city had offered her a kind of stillness she had never known. But one morning, she had packed her bag and left. She told herself it was time to move on, that she was not meant for quiet days and familiar faces. But now, standing by the river again, she wondered if she had walked away from something she needed. She found a quiet spot near the water, where the stones met the sand. The river moved slowly, carrying small pieces of the past with it. Clara knelt down and gathered a handful of sand, letting it run through her fingers before placing some into her bottle. She labeled it Porto and sat on a bench nearby, watching the boats drift by. The city was still beautiful, still full of life. But now it also held a question. That evening, in her small rented room, Clara poured a few grains of sand into her palm. She held them up to the light of a single lamp. One grain shimmered, and the world around her softened. In the vision, she saw herself behind the counter of the bookshop. Her hair was shorter, her clothes simple. She smiled as she handed a book to a young girl. The shop was warm and full of light. Friends came in and out, bringing stories and laughter. After work, she joined them at a cafe, where they shared wine and talked about books, music, and dreams. Her life was small, but full. She was not famous, not traveling, but she was known and loved in her little corner of the world. Clara returned to the present with a quiet heart. The vision had touched something deep inside her. It was not dramatic or magical. It was ordinary. But in that simplicity, there was something beautiful. She had seen a version of herself who had chosen to stay, to build a life in one place, to grow roots instead of wings. That version had peace, connection, and rhythm. Clara felt a wave of doubt. Had she made the wrong choice? Had she been chasing something that could never be caught? Was her search for meaning just a way to avoid stillness? She opened her journal and began to write. She described the bookshop, the faces of the people, the feeling of belonging. She drew a small map of the street, the cafe, and the river. She added a note. Porto. A life of quiet joy. No adventure, but no loneliness. She sat for a long time, thinking. She had always believed that movement was her truth. But now she saw that stillness had its own kind of truth. She had not chosen wrong. She had simply chosen differently. But the question stayed with her, soft and persistent. Clara looked out the window at the city lights reflecting on the river. She thought about the people she had met here, the moments she had lived, and the version of herself who had stayed. That life was not less. It was just another path. She held the bottle close and whispered a silent thank you to the woman in the bookshop. She did not envy her. She respected her. And in that quiet respect, Clara found a new kind of peace. She was learning that every life had value, even the ones she did not live. The sand was not judging her. It was showing her the many ways a life could be full. And that, she realized, was the real gift. Chapter 5. Sand from Coimbra. Clara Vincent arrived in Coimbra on a quiet afternoon. The city was filled with soft hills, narrow streets, and the sound of bells ringing from the old university tower. The buildings were covered in faded stone, and students walked in small groups, carrying books and laughing. Clara had always loved the feeling of this place. Years ago, when she was young and full of questions, she had dreamed of studying here. She had imagined herself walking through the university halls, reading in the library, and writing papers late into the night. But life had taken her in another direction. She had chosen to travel, to collect stories, to live without walls. Now, standing in the heart of the city, she wondered what might have happened if she had stayed. She walked through the university courtyard, where the stone steps were worn smooth by time. She passed the library, its windows tall and quiet, and stopped near a small garden behind the main building. The ground there was dry, with patches of sand between the stones. Clara knelt down and gathered a small handful, brushing away leaves and dust. She placed the sand into her bottle and sat on a bench nearby. The air was warm, and the trees moved gently in the breeze. She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the city, footsteps, voices, the rustle of pages. It felt like a place where ideas lived. That evening, in her small room above a cafe, Clara poured a few grains of sand into her palm. She held them up to the light of the setting sun. One grain caught her eye. It shimmered softly, and the world around her began to fade. In the vision, she saw herself standing in front of a classroom. She was older, dressed in simple clothes, with glasses and a calm voice. Students sat in rows, listening closely as she spoke about history, memory, and the power of stories. Her office was filled with books, papers, and small gifts from students. She spent her days teaching, reading, and writing. Her life was full of meaning, full of purpose. But it was also quiet. She rarely left the city. Her world was small, but deep. Clara returned to the present with a thoughtful heart. The vision had shown her a version of herself she had once wanted to become. A professor, a guide, someone who helped others grow. That life had beauty. It had structure, respect, and a clear path. But it also had limits. There was no travel, no unknown roads, no sudden changes. It was a life of roots, not wings. Clara felt both admiration and sadness. She admired the woman in the vision, her strength and focus. But she also felt the weight of what was missing, the wildness, the freedom, the open sky. She opened her journal and began to write. She described the classroom, the students, the quiet joy of teaching. She drew a small sketch of the university tower and the garden where she had found the sand. She added a note, Coimbra. A life of meaning. Deep, but still. She sat for a long time, thinking about the choices she had made. She had always believed in movement, in change, in collecting pieces of the world. But now she saw that every life was a compromise. You could not have everything. To choose one path was to leave another behind. And that was not failure. That was simply life. Clara looked out the window at the darkening sky. The lights of the city began to glow, and the streets below filled with quiet voices. She held the bottle close and whispered a silent thank you to the professor she had seen. That version of herself had lived with purpose, had given something to others. Clara did not regret her own path, but she now understood it better. She was not lost. She was simply walking a different road. And the sand, with all its silent visions, was helping her see that every version of herself had value. Every life had its own kind of truth. And in that truth, there was peace. Chapter 6. Sand from Lisbon. Clara Vincent arrived in Lisbon on a windy afternoon. The city was alive with movement. Trams rattled along the hills, people filled the cafes, and music drifted from open windows. The sky was pale blue, and the river shimmered in the distance. Clara walked through the familiar streets with a quiet heart. She had lived here once, many years ago, when she was younger and unsure of what she wanted. Lisbon had been a place of beginnings and endings. It was here, at the train station, that she had made a decision that changed her life. She had chosen to leave, to follow the unknown, to keep moving. Now, she had returned to collect a handful of sand from that very place. She made her way to the Santa Apollonia station, where the trains came and went with steady rhythm. The platform was busy, filled with travelers, families, and people in a hurry. Clara stood near the edge, watching the tracks stretch into the distance. She remembered the day she had stood there with her suitcase, heart pounding, unsure if she was brave or foolish. She had left behind a man who loved her, a small apartment with yellow curtains, and a job that paid just enough. She had told herself she needed more space, more questions, more sky. But now, with the bottle of sand in her bag, she wondered what she had left behind. She found a quiet corner near the edge of the platform, where the ground was dry and dusty. The sand there was mixed with gravel and bits of old leaves. She knelt down and scooped a small amount into her cloth bag, then poured it into the glass bottle. She labeled it, Lisbon, and held it in her hands for a long time. The bottle felt heavier than usual, as if it carried more than just sand. She walked back to her room in the old part of the city, where the streets were narrow and the walls were covered in faded tiles. That night, as the city lights flickered outside her window, Clara sat at her desk and poured a few grains of sand into her palm. She held them up to the soft light of a candle. One grain sparkled, and the room around her began to fade. In the vision, she saw herself in a small apartment filled with books, plants, and the sound of laughter. She was older, sitting at a kitchen table with a man and two children. They were eating dinner, passing plates, telling stories. The walls were covered with drawings and photographs. The room was warm, full of life. She worked at a local museum, organizing exhibits and helping visitors. Her days were simple, filled with routine and care. She walked the same streets each morning, greeted the same neighbors, and returned home to the same faces. It was a life of rhythm, of comfort, of love. Clara blinked and returned to the present. The grain of sand lay still in her hand. The vision had touched her deeply. It was not grand or exciting, but it was full. That version of herself had chosen to stay, to build something steady. She had chosen family, community, and the quiet joy of belonging. Clara felt a wave of emotion, warmth, sorrow, and a quiet ache. Her own life had been full of movement, of discovery, of wonder. But it had also been lonely. She had seen many places, but she had often eaten alone. She had met many people, but few had stayed. She opened her journal and began to write. She described the apartment, the dinner table, the sound of laughter. She drew a small sketch of the kitchen window and the faces around it. She added a note. Lisbon. A life of love. Predictable, but full. She sat for a long time, thinking about the woman in the vision. That woman had not seen the world, but she had built a world of her own. Clara did not regret her path, but she now saw it more clearly. Every choice had a cost. Every road left another behind. And sometimes, the roads not taken whispered the loudest. She looked out the window at the city below. The lights of Lisbon sparkled like stars, and the wind moved gently through the trees. She held the bottle close and whispered a silent thank you to the woman who had stayed. That life was not hers, but it was real. It was not better or worse, just different. Clara was learning that life was not about choosing the perfect path. It was about walking the one you chose with open eyes and an open heart. The sand had shown her that every version of herself had something to teach. And in that lesson, she found peace. Chapter 7. Sand from Faro. Clara Vincent arrived in Faro as the sun began to lower behind the rooftops. The southern city was quiet, wrapped in golden light and the soft scent of salt from the nearby sea. The streets were wide and calm, with white buildings and orange trees lining the paths. Faro felt slower than the other places she had visited. It carried a sense of rest, of endings, of reflection. Clara had come here for one reason. She knew this would be her final stop. The last grain of sand. The last vision. The last version of herself waiting to be seen. She walked toward the edge of the city, where the land met the water. The beach was empty, except for a few birds and the sound of waves touching the shore. Clara sat down on a low stone wall and looked out at the sea. It was calm, wide, and endless. She thought about all the places she had been, all the choices she had made, and all the lives she had glimpsed through the grains of sand. Each one had shown her something true. Something she had gained. Something she had lost. Now, she was ready to see the final thread. She stood and walked slowly along the sand, letting her feet sink into the warm surface. She found a quiet spot near a cluster of rocks, where the sand was soft and untouched. She knelt down and scooped a small amount into her cloth bag. The grains were pale and fine, almost white. She poured them into her bottle and wrote the final label, Faro. Then she sat again, holding the bottle in her hands, watching the sun fall lower in the sky. The light turned orange, then pink, then soft blue. It was the kind of sunset that made everything feel gentle. Back in her room, Clara lit a small candle and poured a few grains of sand into her palm. She held them up to the light, her breath slow and steady. One grain shimmered, and the world around her faded. In the vision, she saw herself as an older woman, sitting in a wooden chair on a porch by the sea. Her hair was white, her skin lined with time, but her eyes were bright. Around her were children, laughing, playing, asking questions. Some were hers, some were not, but they all felt like family. The house was simple, filled with books, shells, and drawings. She spent her days telling stories, cooking meals, and walking along the shore. Her life was quiet, but full of love. She had stayed in one place, built something lasting, and shared it with others. Clara blinked and returned to the present. The grain of sand lay still in her hand. The vision had been soft, warm, and full of peace. She felt no sadness, only understanding. That life would have been happy. It would have given her comfort, connection, and the joy of watching others grow. But it was not the life she had chosen. She had chosen movement, solitude, and the search for meaning. She had chosen to walk alone, to learn deeply, and to see the world through many eyes. She had not built a home, but she had built a map of lives. And that, she knew, was her gift. She opened her journal and wrote slowly. She described the porch, the sea, the children's laughter. She drew a sketch of the house and the chair by the door. She added a note, Faro. A life of love and rest. Not mine, but beautiful. She closed the journal and placed the bottle beside it. 7 places. 7 grains. 7 versions of herself. Each one had shown her something she needed to see. Not to change her path, but to understand it. She had not missed her life. She had lived it fully, with eyes open and heart awake. Clara sat by the window and watched the stars appear. The night was quiet, and the sea whispered in the distance. She felt calm, complete, and ready. She had seen who she could have been. She had honored each version. And now, she could return to herself, not with regret, but with peace. She had chosen a life of freedom, knowledge, and depth. And through the sand, she had learned that every life, even the ones not lived, had something to teach. Chapter 8. Return. Clara Vincent returned to Nazare on a quiet morning. The sky was soft and gray, and the sea moved slowly, like it was breathing. The town looked the same as before, white houses with red roofs, narrow streets, and the sound of waves in the distance. But Clara was not the same. She had walked through cities and memories. She had seen herself in many lives, each shaped by a different choice. Now she had come back to the place where her journey began, carrying a bottle filled with sand and stories. She walked down to the beach, the same beach where she had first collected sand in silence. The wind touched her face gently, and the air smelled of salt and thyme. She sat on the same rock near the water and placed the bottle beside her. It was full now, heavy with grains from Nazare, Évora, Sintra, Porto, Coimbra, Lisbon, and Faro. Each grain held a vision, a version of herself, a life she had not lived but had seen. She looked at the bottle for a long time, remembering what each place had shown her. Not just images, but feelings, love, peace, doubt, joy, and longing. Clara opened the bottle slowly and poured the sand into her hand. The grains sparkled in the morning light, each one small and quiet. She stood up and walked toward the edge of the sea. The waves reached her feet, cold and steady. She let the sand fall from her hand, letting it mix with the shore. The grains disappeared into the beach, into the earth, into the water. She did not try to hold on to them. She let them go, knowing they had already done their work. They had shown her not what she had missed, but what she had carried all along. As she watched the sand disappear, Clara felt something shift inside her. It was not sadness. It was not regret. It was peace. She understood now that every choice she had made was part of her path. There were no wrong turns, only different roads. Each decision had shaped her, taught her, and brought her here. The lives she had seen were not better or worse. They were simply other ways of being. She had not failed by choosing one and not the others. She had lived her life with honesty, with courage, and with an open heart. She sat on the sand and opened her journal one last time. She wrote a final note, Nazare. Return. All lives together. I am whole. She closed the book and placed it beside her. The sea moved forward and back, like time itself. Clara watched the horizon, not looking for answers, but simply being present. She no longer needed to ask what could have been. She had seen enough to know that life was not about perfect choices. It was about living with awareness, with kindness, and with acceptance. Clara stood up and walked along the beach. Her steps were slow, but steady. She did not know where she would go next, and that was fine. She had learned that the journey was not about reaching a final place. It was about walking with open eyes, listening to the world, and honoring the life she had chosen. The bottle was empty now, but her heart was full. She had seen many versions of herself, and in doing so, she had found her center. She was not lost. She was home. Moral: every choice creates a new reality. We cannot live all lives, but we can accept our own, with its light and shadow. A grain of sand may show who we could have been, but only we decide who we become. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.